Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's great to have everyone here in the room from our annual board forum, where we've had off-record and now another on-record session. And it's wonderful to have our global virtual audience for this special event. It's part of our Commander Series, a flagship speaker forum for senior military and defense leaders, generously supported by Saab, and I want to thank Mike Anderson, a member of the executive committee of our board, who's here also representing Saab. This event is called Commanding the Alliance Perspectives from SACEURs, Supreme Allied Commanders Europe. Since its launch in 2009, the Commander Series has provided a platform for addressing the most pressing security challenges of our time. Over the years, it has grown into one of the Atlantic Council's most valued and enduring programs. Earlier this year, we welcomed General Cavoli, Chris Cavoli, the current Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and you'll hear a little bit from him again in a moment. This summer, the Atlantic Council was honored to support the NATO Public Forum on the margins of the Washington Summit to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Alliance and discuss the most pressing challenges to transatlantic security. 75 years ago, in the aftermath of 2 world wars, 12 countries came together to sign the Washington Treaty, forging what has become the world's most enduring and successful military alliance. NATO was founded on the bedrock principle of collective security and defense, a concept so strong it shepherded the alliance to victory in the Cold War and has anchored U.S. global leadership in the decades since. However, in 2022, in February, a shadow was cast across the transatlantic alliance as Russia brought war back to the European mainland. Believing the alliance was weak and disjointed, the Kremlin launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine using force in an attempt to redraw borders and upend European and global security. In the 3 years since, NATO allies have weathered Moscow's coercion attempts, provided immense aid to Kiev to sustain Ukrainian warfighting effort, and expanded the alliance to include 2 new members, Finland and Sweden. So although the goal was to weaken the alliance has emerged stronger. And through all of this, NATO continues to maintain broad support from the citizens across the alliance, including the majority of Americans who view NATO as essential to global leadership. Despite these successes, as we've heard throughout the day here, our adversaries grow bolder. North Korean troops are joining their Russian counterparts in their war against Ukraine. Even some Houthis are on the battlefield now from Yemen, while Beijing and Tehran are increasingly providing Moscow with the material and technologies necessary to sustain a war of attrition. It's fair to say that without Pyongyang and Beijing and Tehran, this war could not be sustained. The growing cooperation among these actors allows Russia to circumvent Western sanctions and grow the wartime economy. This so-called axis of aggressors are working together in a more concerted manner than the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan did in the 1930s. At the Atlantic Council, we see convenings such as this as integral to promoting our shared values. We aim to do so by galvanizing U.S. leadership and engagement in the world in partnership with allies and partners. In this spirit, Ambassador Colleen Bell, a former ambassador of the United States to Hungary and a board member of the Atlantic Council, will moderate a conversation with a group of distinguished Supreme Allied Commanders in Europe who can provide a first-hand perspective of the challenges that NATO faces and the enduring value of the alliance. We are going to have more 4 stars for you today than is normally the case on any panel. The panelists are all Atlantic Council board directors and 4 stars, including General James L. Jones, General Philip Breedlove, General Wesley Clark, General Curtis Scaparrotti, and General Rod Walters. It's a particular pleasure to welcome General Jones here today, and not only because he's a role model for me, an inspiration to me, but besides General Brent Scowcroft, General Jones is the only other individual to have served twice as the Atlantic Council chairman. He's also the only person I think in history has been Marine Commandant, has been Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and has been National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. Even beyond that, I'm really happy to announce the creation of the General James L. Jones Situation Room in our new global headquarters, located on the 9th floor, which will blend cherished memorabilia from General Jones with cutting-edge technology. So please join me in a round of applause for the General James L. Jones Situation Room. Before this panel discussion begins, and before Ambassador Bell takes over, it's my pleasure to introduce General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of the United States European Command, for pre-recorded framing remarks. Remarkable individual, led NATO allies, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe with courage, conviction, and clarity. The Atlantic Council was honored to present General Cavoli with our Distinguished Military Leadership Award last May. So it's my pleasure that I turn over the screen and to you, General Cavoli.
General Jones, members of the Board of Directors, many thanks for putting this event together. It's really an honor to speak to you in this forum today, amongst so many of my distinguished predecessors, each of whom helped shape this alliance. So I'd like to start by highlighting our very first predecessor, the first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the man who forged the coalition that defeated the Axis powers in the Second World War. It's a man whose vision then set the foundation for the strongest military alliance in the history of the world. General Dwight D. Eisenhower took the hard-earned lessons from the European theater and created a formidable military structure to complement NATO's political body. In doing so, he understood that the alliance's strength would not only lie in its military formations, but also in the unity and the cohesion of its member nations. So he set out to integrate the forces of 12 sovereign states, each with its own military culture, each with its own national interest, and he built a command structure committed to a common cause. Through the decades that followed, it wasn't always easy. A number of crises tested the alliance's resolve and threatened its unity. But Eisenhower's vision endured. The alliance endured. When tensions exploded in the Balkans in the 1990s, NATO responded swiftly to ensure the collective security of its neighborhood. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, the alliance declared Article 5 for the first and only time and rushed to America's defense. Now, with Russia wreaking destruction on the European continent, NATO has once again risen to the occasion. Nations have stood united and resolute, recommitting the alliance to deterrence and defense. We've undertaken a wholesale modernization of our system of collective defense. Allies have approved our first set of defensive plans since 1989. We've redesigned our command and control structures. We've given SACEUR unprecedented new authorities to act with speed. And we have a new force model that has put more troops devoted to collective defense than in decades. And capitals are backing these changes with real increases in defense spending that is up collectively by more than a third since 2022. It's truly remarkable what we're achieving together. Over the past 75 years, NATO has accomplished feats that individual nations could not do alone. But what we must remember is that this didn't happen by accident. It was built over time, through tireless effort, through leadership, through vision. Just as Eisenhower recognized over 7 decades ago, our strength is rooted in the trust and solidarity of nations who stand together in the face of adversity. And now, we stand together as 32 nations, dedicated to pursuing peace, prosperity, and a brighter future for the entire alliance. Thank you all.
Thank you, General Cavoli, for sharing those insightful and valuable remarks with us today. And thank you, Fred, for the introduction. I am Colleen Bell. I am the former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary. I am also a board director here at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to moderate today's conversation discussing the very important role of NATO and how it plays in protecting our collective security and safeguarding the democratic, rules-based order. To provide a firsthand perspective of the value of the NATO alliance, I am joined on stage and online by a distinguished panel of former Supreme Allied Commanders Europe. It's truly remarkable to have all of you assembled here in one place on the screen, and the 3 of you here. Together with these panelists, They have unmatched experience in the role dating back from 1997 to the present day with General Cavoli. With that, I am pleased to introduce our panelists. We have General Wesley Clark, who served as Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 1997 to 2000. General James Jones served as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 2003 to 2006, and he is also the Atlantic Council's Executive Chairman Emeritus. General Philip Breedlove, joining us virtually, served as Supreme Allied Commander Europe from 2013 to 2016. General Curtis Scaparotti served as Supreme Allied Commander from 2016 to 2019. And General Todd Walters, who is also joining us virtually, served as Supreme Allied Commander from 2019 to 2022. I think that this is pretty extraordinary, this moment that you're all witnessing right now, because since the inception of NATO, there have only been 20 Supreme Allied Commanders. And today, we have 5 on the panel, and we had General Cavoli, who was joining us earlier with his remarks. We have General Clark, who was the 12th, General Jones, who was the 14th, General Breedlove, the 17th, General Scaparotti, the 18th, Walters, the 19th, and General Cavoli, the 20th. So thank you, Atlantic Council, for offering this very unique opportunity for all of us to have you here. So importantly to mention, all 5 generals who are here with us today are also members of the Atlantic Council's Board of Directors, and we thank you very much, generals, for being with us. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to remind our audience of a few very important housekeeping items. First, this discussion is on the record. And second, we will have time at the end for audience questions. We encourage our in-person audience to raise their hands and our virtual audience to please present questions online at askac.org. And so with that, let's get started. In order to explore the historical significance of the NATO Alliance and to frame the discussion, I would like to give each of you a few minutes to answer 3 main questions. These 3 questions are, first, what were the major events for the Alliance that transpired under your watch? Second, what were some unresolved issues that outlasted your tenure as Supreme Allied Commander Europe? And lastly, following up on General Cavoli's remarks, what are your thoughts on the recent shifts in the Alliance to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Okay, we will hear from each former SACEUR in the chronological order of their time in the role, starting with General Clark. Once we hear from each panelist, we will turn it over to the audience for questions and answers. General Clark?
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
So my experience with NATO began in 1978 when I was a speechwriter and assistant executive officer for General Al Haig. I came back to worry about NATO in 1994 as the J5 on the Joint Staff. I'm sorry General George Jalwin isn't here. He was the 11th NATO commander, and I want to fill in some of the missing pieces that George would fill in on. First, there was a decision to enlarge NATO. This wasn't an easy decision, and the Pentagon wasn't necessarily in favor of it, but the president himself made the decision in summer of 1994. On Labor Day weekend, Al Gore gave a speech in Berlin, and the policy was set. In J5's office, we wrote the membership action plan and carried it out. NATO was involved in enforcing embargo on arms shipments into Bosnia. So we had Operation Deny Flight and Operation Display Determination, a naval embargo and an air embargo. We were supporting the UN UNPROFOR, and in the summer of 1995, it began to be clear that UNPROFOR on the ground in Bosnia was not going to stop the fighting. And so after a marketplace bombing, General Shalikashvili led the NATO nations to make the decision that NATO would respond to the next aggravation. And so there was a short series of bombing directed by General Jalwin, Admiral Leighton Smith in the fall of '95. At the same time, I was with Ambassador Holbrooke and a team, and we were negotiating the Dayton Peace Agreement. And as Milosevic told us, the Serb leader, he said, this bombing is bad for peace. And we said, no, Mr. President, we think this bombing is really good for peace. And he had had enough, and we got the Dayton Peace Agreement done. It committed 25,000 NATO troops to Bosnia. And so NATO was on the ground, armed forces, ready to fight in Bosnia. And we had the silver bullet clause in place in a couple of places that said the NATO commander on the ground, without any political authorization, can take whatever action he deems necessary to prevent violations of the agreement. It was a really powerful tasking, and we never had any violations. We subsequently began to pick up war criminals. I came on the scene as NATO commander in '97. We had the forces on the ground. Prime Minister Blair had led the effort to have NATO pick up war criminals. Previous thinking, President Clinton's thinking, General Jalvin's thinking was, God, don't do this. You're going to get a fight started. But we did it, and after the initial displays in the fall of '97 of some mob actions, we picked up war criminals. But at the same time, Milosevic was beginning to see that if he did something in Kosovo, he could put displaced Croatian Serbs into Kosovo. And so he tightened up on his military operations there, and he began an ethnic cleansing campaign. It started in the spring of 1998. NATO decided that it could not stand by and see it happen. We set up a program, a graduated program that essentially gave NATO escalation dominance if Milosevic didn't stop the ethnic cleansing. After 3 rounds of negotiation, after a NATO activation order, the first in history, in the fall of '98, Milosevic appeared to back off, but a Russian military delegation showed up in Belgrade in December of '98. We don't know exactly what they said, but the consequence of it was that Milosevic said, you know, I'm not so worried about NATO's air power. I think the Russians told him we used air power in Afghanistan, didn't do us much good. Don't worry about NATO, clean it up here. And so in January of '99, the ethnic cleansing restarted. I don't know, was any of the previous? Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't want to repeat it. So in January of '99, it restarted. The French tried to negotiate a way through it. Serbia refused, and so on the 24th of March of 1999, President Clinton gave the order, and NATO seconded the order to begin the use of air power in a coercive diplomatic effort against Milosevic. So we established escalation dominance, increase the number of aircraft, increase the number of targets, increase the scope of the strikes, et cetera. And by early April, we had a diplomatic initiative in hand. And at the 50th NATO summit, nations were, of course, horrified that NATO was at war. Wasn't supposed to happen. What a terrible thing for the NATO summit. President Clinton said, we're going to do anything necessary to succeed in this mission, which meant planning for ground troops. And with that, and the negotiations and the help of Finnish President Ahtisaari and Russian Vice President Chernomyrdin, we did achieve an agreement. Serb forces were pulled out completely, and 1.4 million Albanians surged back in to Kosovo. The UN took over a mission there. NATO established KFOR, and it's still there today in some form. And subsequently, it became independent. I'll say, so what happened exactly? During this period, the Russian intelligence agents, 97 to 2000, reestablished strong control in Moscow. Putin became the head of Russian intelligence. Yevgeny Primakov became the foreign minister, and when Putin was prime minister and spoke at Ukrainian President Kuchma's inauguration, President Kvasnevsky sent to me his intelligence chief to say, Putin's aiming to restore the Soviet Union. That's the aim. So that was where we ended up, from the idealism of the early Clinton years into Primakov and Putin by 1999 and 2000. I told Tony Blair when I was leaving command about Putin. Prime Minister Blair said, "I think he's someone we can work with." And so with that sunny way that Prime Minister Blair had, we glossed over what was happening there. The French decided that never again would Americans tell them what or where they would bomb, and so immediately in the aftermath in '99, there was a convocation of the Europeans. They reemphasized the European security and defense programs. They pledged to up their budgets, create the capacity to do everything that was needed, and basically not have to listen to Americans anymore. But of course, it never really took off. It never really got funded. What we found in the operation, of course, was that only France had the ability, in addition to the Americans, to do precision strike. So the Brits were very eager to go in and get the Serbs on the ground in Kosovo, but they didn't have the technology to do it. The Italians also didn't have the technology, and many other aircraft from other nations participated, but we had to keep them out of the direct engagement because they didn't have the technology that was required. We also didn't have a joint intelligence system. So there were two separate air tasking orders done. One was U.S. only. That included the Stealth and the Tomahawk missiles, and the other was for NATO. And so there was always a little bit of friction in that. I think where we ended up after that was that the alliance was on the ground. Russia was and China were put on alert to what American high technology could do, and that's pretty much where I left it. I'm really happy with where we are right now, starting with what the Russians did in Ukraine in 2013-14. I think NATO's responded really well. I want to congratulate the SACEURs who have led that going forward and made it work, and I'm really proud of what General Cavoli's doing. It's been a remarkable restoration of the kind of NATO responsiveness that I had known when I was General Haig's executive officer in '78, '79. So we're not quite full circle yet, but we're sure getting there.
Well, thank you very much, General Clark, and I'll turn it over to General Jones.
Thank you very much. I replaced General Ralston as SACEUR in January of 2003 and stayed until the late December of 2006. Clearly, one of the most important events during my watch was the expansion of NATO from 19 to 26 countries in 2004. Also, during that period, there was a very active NATO-Russia Council and Russia-Ukraine Council, which is interesting. There were two separate councils, but everybody really got along pretty well. We visited Ukraine, we visited Russia, we actually had NATO training exercises in Ukraine. It was a very interesting time between individual nations, but with regard to Russia and Ukraine having a relationship with NATO. During my 4 years, we activated the NATO response force with two major deployments, one humanitarian in Pakistan and the other one an operational deployment in Cape Verde in the deepest part of Africa to try to show what the NRF was capable of. It was a fantastic demonstration. We established a NATO training mission in Baghdad, which was very successful. We reintegrated France into the military alliance, so to speak. They were already there, but we formalized it and actually raised the French flag outside of the SHAPE headquarters. SHAPE became really a strategic headquarters in every sense of the word, and was really referred to as the Allied Command for Operations. One of the biggest shocks that I had as SACEUR was very shortly after I got there and attended my first ambassador's lunch. I didn't realize I was on the menu, but the British ambassador stood up and said, I'm the host and I get to ask the first question. So, General, how are you going to get NATO into Afghanistan? I had studied everything I possibly could about NATO and its history. Afghanistan was not on my menu, and so I fumbled that ball, but caught up pretty quickly because it was clear that after the invocation of NATO's Article 5 for the first time in the history of the alliance, this was a serious proposition. We established a NATO Intelligence Fusion Center that is still, I'm happy to say, alive and operating. It used to be that all countries contributing to operations would bring their own intelligence center, but they wouldn't necessarily share the intelligence that they gathered. So NATO Intelligence Fusion Center was created. We also established a NATO Special Operations Force that, for the first time, under Admiral McRaven, who was SACEUR at the time, Rear Admiral McRaven was absolutely fantastic in creating the first ever Special Operations Force. So those were some of the highlights that I think the deployment to Afghanistan was certainly a fantastic privilege to operate. We received the tasking order in 2003. And we briefed the deployment plan in 2004 at the Munich Security Conference. Some of the problems that I passed on to my successors certainly had to do with going back to the Prague Summit of 2002, where it was established that everybody would contribute at least 2% of their GDP to enhance their military capabilities. Very few did that, and I must say that during my watch, we made a little progress, but not to the degree that we've achieved recently. The other one that was a real thorn in my sides was the idea of every donation that every country made to an operation had a list of national caveats that caused commanders to spend more time thinking about what they couldn't do with their troops than what they could do. And I would like to say that we made a lot of progress on that, but I don't think we did, as you'll hear from. But there's some good news here, I think, as you'll hear from my successors. And then the third one was how do you allocate resources within the alliance? The popular phrase was costs fall where they lie, which means that if you provide troops, you're going to pay for them. There was little in the way of common funding in those days, but the resourcing of operations was a real problem and rapidly escalated in some cases to a very big political problem. And lastly, I must say, in a tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but my scratchy relations with the military committee was stuff of legends, and I pass them on cheerfully to my successors. But I want to focus on the third question that the ambassador asked, and that is, the defense of Europe is now a valid strategic concept, and it's necessary. And what the alliance has achieved, particularly with the last 4 SACEURs that you're going to hear from in succession, has been nothing short of fantastic. From not only the creation of plans, but the resourcing of plans, the deployment of troops, the establishing of the defense of Europe in a new line between the Baltics and the Balkans is very clear and very necessary. And I'm really proud of the jobs that they have done to transform the alliance and make it extremely relevant. The 2% of GDP is now exceeded by 23 countries, at least 2% and over. And I think you're going to see more of that. And you've heard General Cavoli talk about the transformation that the alliance has gone through just in the last several years. So I think the rise of Central and Eastern Europe, and the closer you get to the Russia-Ukraine fight, the more concerned they are, and that's exactly what it ought to be. And frankly, the NATO infrastructure that's being restored and rebuilt as a result of all of this is something we should all be excited about. And lastly, I'll just close by saying I think the United States is fortunate to be able to lead the alliance in the operational sense, and it's a real privilege to have served for 4 years there. And let me pass it on.
Thank you, General Jones. And now we'll turn it over to General Breedlove.
For having me. It's a privilege to be appearing with these gentlemen who I've looked up to so much in my life and served with. Again, I was privileged to move from Ramstein as the USAFE commander and the NATO AirCom commander to become the SACEUR. It was a distinct privilege, and so I was very familiar with what was going on as far as the tactical part of what was happening in Afghanistan and others. Within days of arriving at Mons, the conversation turned to how we were going to draw down forces in Afghanistan. President Obama, of course, not right or wrong, but his desire was to have a very public, very scheduled, very calendar and very numbers-driven event, and announce that to the world and make sort of some progress on how we would begin to get out of Afghanistan. At the time, Joe Dunford was commanding U.S. forces in Afghanistan, and as the SACEUR, my headquarters was in charge of the NATO forces in Afghanistan, and neither Joe Dunford nor I wanted to do a public calendar-driven sort of withdrawal. We wanted to do what many have heard military people describe as a conditions-based withdrawal, whereby we would draw down as we accomplish certain objectives in and around Afghanistan. And so for the first 5-ish or 5.5 months, that was the real picture, moving back and forth to Brussels, moving back and forth to the United States, trying to affect more military-style conditions-based drawdown. Then Mr. Putin interrupted everybody's life. When in the late winter of 13, early winter of 14, Mr. Putin first invaded Crimea and then amassed his armies and invaded the eastern edge, the Donbass portion of Ukraine. And everything shifted in what we were focused on. The initial responses were hard to move through the system at NATO. One of my most vivid memories was showing up one morning thinking I had an agenda that I understood, and I found out that my agenda had been totally rearranged because a Polish and a Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian group of ambassadors and chiefs of defense were waiting on me when I got there. And essentially the message was, okay, Mr. Ambassador, we're next. Okay, Mr. SACEUR, we're next. What are you going to do about it? And trying to meet the requirements of these nations that very much felt threatened over the next couple of months was a singular focus of our headquarters. We were unable to convince the NAC to take certain actions that we thought might be prudent, but we all understand civilian control of the military, and the NAC gave us a sort of stand down guidance until the second invasion when Russia came into the Donbass. Then things got a little more pitched, and more nations were demanding what is the SACEUR going to do about it. And then began a series for almost 2.5 years of increasing readiness and capability of NATO troops in order to meet these very pressing requirements of those nations who felt threatened. The latter part of my tour was, of course, dominated by preparation for and then being a part of the Wales Summit and watching our world's leaders come together to try to memorialize certain decisions that we had already moved through the staffs of NATO and through the various ministerials that lead up to a summit. And so getting through Wales and getting essentially most of what we asked for was very important. And then the very last few months of my tenure were in starting to fill out the decisions made at Wales. I'm going to combine a few thoughts with what I think was the biggest problem I handed over to SCAP. I think we made a lot of progress, and that is on NATO readiness. We really didn't understand NATO readiness before Russia invaded Crimea. I will just say that some nations had units they were calling ready. And when we really dug into it, that meant that they could have it ready in 365 days. And so we had some nations that really needed to work on what we in the United States and other nations, Great Britain, France, and others, what we meant by readiness and being able to fight at threat speed if required. And so we began to, through the Wales Summit and the actions after the Wales Summit, as you know, and I won't waste our times here, but we started bringing more units up to higher readiness. We started pre-positioning and doing things that would make it easier to bring those forces to bear in the crazy instance that we might have to. And we were solely focused on meeting the new requirements, getting readiness to the point where we could. And then I sort of handed a big old ball of problems to SCAP, and he'll talk to you about how he cleaned up my messes in a minute. I would tell you that my vision or my thoughts about what's most important now to sort of keep the ball moving, they fall in two very distinct categories. The first is that I think that we have been too soft and we're a lack of public declaration of policy in Ukraine and how we're going to support Ukraine. Many of you have heard me talk about our statements by our leaders at the beginning of the war. We're going to be there for as long as it takes. We're going to give them everything they need. And my questions are, to do what? To throw a birthday party, to go across the Dnieper River, to retake the land in Donbass? What is it that finishes those two sentences? And I think that we need to continue today to work on having a very public, a very declaratory policy on what our support to Ukraine means and what the goals that we seek for Ukraine are. And that would really help set the stage for the upcoming negotiations that we think should be out there. Second, I believe that we need to regain or we need to reestablish deterrence in many parts of what we do as an alliance. These are my buckets. They probably don't make a lot of sense to some, but I think of our deterrence in 4 buckets. The strategic nuclear deterrence, I think that bucket is still healthy, and we're in good shape. The tactical nuclear bucket, and I would also include WMD, since we've seen Russia using chemicals and other agents like that already in Ukraine, we are losing deterrence in the tactical nuclear and the WMD portion of our deterrent package. And then finally, I would say that in conventional deterrence, I believe that NATO is to be congratulated. We still have strong conventional deterrence as it relates to NATO lands. But I think that we are going to have to, as a Western alliance with other Western partners, we need to reestablish deterrence in non-NATO territories. We have been adamant over and over that we're going to defend every inch of NATO. I think what Mr. Putin hears is everything else is fair game. We see him acting immensely below the lines of war in Georgia. We see him acting incredibly actively now in Moldova. And these are not the end of where he has ambition for. So we need to together think about reestablishing deterrence in the non-NATO spaces. We have ceded that deterrence. And then the last is, I don't think that we have really begun to discuss deterrence in the gray zone or in the hybrid zone or in the war below the line zone, however you want to describe it. Really important article several days ago about nearly 100 events that have happened in NATO spaces that researchers now believe and reporters now believe are attributed to Russian actions in the hybrid or gray zone. And so we essentially have no deterrence in the gray zone, and we need to think about how to do it. Okay, handing it over to Scap.
Thank you, Phil. So you know where I was pretty much in 2016 when I came in and took over from Phil. He had really done fine work on getting us oriented back onto Russia. That was my primary focus, as I came in. But within about 5-6 weeks, we had the attempted coup in Turkey, which immediately, woke me up at 1 in the morning, and before we know it, I and General Dunford were on a plane to Turkey there within days as well. So that was one other thing. We also were at the height of the refugee issue within Europe, and that was also a direct focus as NATO worked with fellow countries, border security, NATO maritime operations along with Interpol and others in order to try and control the migration issue into Europe at the same time. So I had an elevator pitch that was essentially the 5 R's, and I think that's the quickest way to tell you what we focused on. And they were Russia, the refugees, the radicals, readiness, and relevance. So Russia, I think you've heard described by Phil. At that time, we also, and Phil didn't mention this, but started the training program from NATO in Ukraine that made all the difference in the world 8 years later. So we were focused on how to build that program, how to get them oriented. We helped them set up training centers, et cetera, as a part of that response. The Russians at the time had a new class of submarine they deployed, which was a focus of ours. We had to reestablish what we used to do quite well before in terms of tracking their subs. This was the SEV, a very, very good sub. And for the first time in many years, they began to fly their bombers around Europe. So there was other actions by Russia, along with hybrid actions that Phil mentioned, that we were paying attention to. That was a Russia piece of this. The refugees, right at the height as I came into that problem, and you all recall the issues that created within the countries in the alliance, and particularly in Europe. They began to have to consider closing borders again, et cetera. We had to help them and the police to be able to establish control, particularly in the maritime areas, et cetera. So a large issue that NATO was directly involved in. I mentioned the radicals because, remember, we are, as Phil noted, we had responsibilities as a NATO commander in Afghanistan for the NATO troops, which during the drawdown, the NATO troops became the larger contingent rather than the U.S. one. And to do that and keep, in my case, 29 nations informed and aligned and tracking was serious business. It took a great deal of effort to do that as we went through. The next two was readiness and relevance. readiness Phil mentioned, we essentially, starting with the fine work Phil did, you had to change not only the capabilities, you had to change the mindset across Europe. That was the more difficult piece. There were many that were still hugging the bear, and the bear was not somebody that wanted hugged at that point. So we had to make that mindset change and then start getting the capabilities, the capacity, et cetera, that was required for high-intensity conflict moving in the right direction. Secondly, we had to reestablish our headquarters as warfighting headquarters. EUCOM headquarters at every component as well as NATO. There were new domains. We got the cyber domain agreed upon as a NATO fighting domain. That had not been the case until the time that I was there, and we started working on space, which Todd, I believe, brought in that domain as we came in. And then finally, relevance. I had the headquarters I had to get ready to fight, and then I believed I had planning that had to be done. Phil didn't mention it. He did a great job of writing the first U.S. Defense of Europe plan since, I think, '89, Phil, wasn't it? It was about that time, and brought that through. That helped me immensely because now I had the plan that I nested within the NATO plan that I began to develop, and it later was called the DDA. But I did the strategic part of that, did not get it fully done. And what I'm describing now are the things that I threw over the transom here to Todd. The readiness piece wasn't where we needed it. The planning piece wasn't completely done. We hadn't gotten into the national plans yet. And then finally, the force structure. I tried to increase force structure in NATO to support those plans. We were partially successful. In other words, we got an enlargement of the units and capabilities that nations would provide, but I didn't get them organized in fighting organizations. That was just a bridge too far at the point. And then finally, authorities. We needed greater authorities for the SACEUR because we were living in a dynamic environment in sea, air, ground, cyber, with a Russian that was being very aggressive. And yet, as the SACEUR, I didn't have the authorities to act without going to the Council. I had a lot more authority as the U.S. commander. I could move forces, I could react, I could actually move ahead of them, and could do it without, I had the authorities to do it. So those last things are the things I pitched over to Todd. He had to work authorities, he had to get the force structure right, he still had readiness to fix, and the plan was not done. But in ending, if you look at today, you took all of that which was not in a state to really fight. Todd Walters and Chris Cavoli took all of that at 31 and 32 nations approval to a point today where we have a valid fighting plan in Europe. We have nations that are now being assigned with units in areas they know they're going to operate in. They know their terrain. They know what they need to train for. The 9 Corps in NATO, when I was the SACEUR, I could not tell them what their mission was. I rotated them to keep them trained, but I didn't have a piece of terrain. That's not the case anymore. And if you look at the increase in the force structure, we now have forces organized as they'll fight, being assigned by nations against terrain. That's Cavoli's work. It's amazing. And we've got a NATO that's strong and ready. So with that, I'll turn it over to Todd, and he can tell you the mess I gave him.
Well, thanks, Gap, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and to Fred and to you, Ambassador, for setting all this up. I'll just end where, or start where Scap mentioned. The concept for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area is called DDA. And in clear terms, in air, land, sea, space, and cyber, to include strategic nuclear deterrence and tactical nuclear deterrence, that plan defined what NATO needed to do from a national perspective to be successful. And the beauty of it is once it was memorialized, you now have a plan that allows you to construct a strategy that allows NATO and nations to formulate real military objectives and requirements so that when you get heavy-handed with respect to the 2% GDP, you know where every single euro needs to go so that from the citizen of the nation to the actual NATO military capability, you have strategic coherence. And SCAP set the stage to get that completed. It eventually occurred, and Chris is doing great things as a result of NATO having a proper military strategy that allows him to connect the dots from strategy all the way down to requirements, all the way down to the effect in the environment that he needs to deliver for comprehensive defense. And that was something during my watch from 2019 to 2022 that we were able to close. The second big event that we had during my time was at the time President Trump wanted to pull out all of the U.S. troops from Germany, and I mentioned this just because it had some amazing effects. Number one, as most people know, President Trump was a demanding customer when it came to 2% GDP, and as you can well imagine, as the SACEUR, I was the best friend of every minister of defense and every CHOD for each one of the NATO countries, because they too wanted to get as much money as they could so that they could throw into their capability and throw it into their readiness. And when President Trump was heavy-handed about threatening Germany to pull out all of the U.S. troops, it helped conform Germany to be a little bit more disciplined with respect to their focus on the 2% GDP. And when it was all said and done during the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, that call for pulling out U.S. troops in Germany ended completely. The next big event on our watch was COVID, and I just mentioned this because I must say that when you're a SACEUR and the commander of U.S. European Command, you really rely on your great chairman of the JCS, and at the time Joe Dunford was our general in charge, and his strategic vision for how to handle COVID was masterful. And one of the first things General Dunford mentioned to me is, "Hey Todd, you got to do whatever it takes to make sure that this medical crisis does not turn into a security crisis." And I can only say that I said to myself about 1,000,000 times, follow that logic and you'll probably be in the best shape. And when it was all said and done, through great guidance from Chairman Dunford and through great work by all the component commanders, to include Chris Cavoli, who was our Army component commander, we were able to get through COVID inside of Europe. And what was an international medical crisis never turned into a military requirement or crisis for us in Europe as a result of the great work of the components. The next big event we had was the Afghan refugee withdrawal during our time frame, and we were able to take 144,000 Afghans and pull them out of Afghanistan and get them to the rest of the world. And their port of entry primarily came through Germany, and that was handled masterfully by all the components. It was helped significantly by many nations across the globe. Italy was integral, the U.S. was integral, Germany was integral, and it was something that could have become very, very ugly for the world, and it turned out to be basically a strategic non-event as a result of the great work of the nations. And our last big event during my time was in February of 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. And it was mentioned before by all the SACEURs that this was not a surprise. We actually thought Russia was going to invade Ukraine in the summer prior of 21. It did not happen. We were very, very well prepared for it. And as a result of what took place, the posture of the NATO military forces was in as good a shape as it had been for several years. And immediately we were in a position to house 122,000 uniformed military members along the East German border with a high state of readiness, ready to accomplish the mission to defend every inch of NATO soil that was required. Quickly, the unresolved issues are obviously Russia, Ukraine, and that ties into the 2% GDP, and it also ties into the NATO military readiness. As all of the SACEURs mentioned, readiness was always an issue. It has improved significantly over time. I've never met a commander in my life of any military that will ever look you in the eye and tell you that their current readiness posture is perfect. It's just not. And NATO's readiness is as good as it's ever been. Chris Cavoli is performing miracles along those lines, but he would be the first to tell you that it still nags at him. He's still working on it. And as we continue to be demanding customers as a U.S. nation with respect to all of the nations getting well above 2% GDP, those funds will enhance our overall readiness. And Ambassador, your third question had to do with the disposition of what is taking place with respect to Russia, Ukraine. And my response to that, it hasn't changed. We must win. This is a conflict of values. And we as the United States and we as the NATO, we cannot lose this conflict. And I believe that with every inch of my being, and I suspect that all of the SACEURs on stage would agree with that. And whatever it takes to accomplish that task is something that we're capable of, and it's something that needs to be accomplished, and it needs to be done as quickly as possible to save as many lives on planet Earth as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Walters. Thank you very much, Generals, for your historical context that you provided, your wonderful perspective and recommendations. I know the audience has enjoyed listening to all of you as much as I have. So thank you. And General Clark has let me know that he has a comment that he would like to make before I go ask a question. So
you've heard from the beginning of the post-Cold War until the present day through the eyes of the commanders. And where we stand right now, just to reemphasize and reiterate what Phil and Todd and others have said, is NATO must reestablish deterrence. We had it in 1978. It took 500,000 Americans in Europe to do it. We undertook the peace dividend, but at the same time in the 1990s, NATO leaders and the United States recognized that security in Europe was indivisible, that NATO had to go out of area or be out of business. That's why we went into former Yugoslavia to stop the fight. I can't tell you how shocking it was, how disappointing it has been to see NATO cling to the legalism of the territory of the alliance and not recognize legally, formally, that security in Europe is indivisible. And so just as Todd said and Scap and the rest up here, we have to win in this conflict. There's no going back. The consequences of failure in Ukraine are global. They're not just in Europe. We're against an alliance that's emerging between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. It's not limited to one continent or one theater. So there's a lot of uncertainty in Europe right now. There's a lot of uncertainty in the United States. But I think the truth of it is that Europe remains the decisive cockpit of challenge for future global security. And Europe today is weak and vulnerable. And Europe today needs strong American leadership. That's the key to deterrence. And I just hope that our leadership can see it and follow through on it. Thank you.
thank you very much, General. We have time for one question. So I think we will go, unless do we have a question from the audience first? Otherwise, I will go to a question presented from somebody online. Oh, okay, we have a question. Oh, absolutely, and please identify yourself.
Thanks for this all-star panel, or all-stars panel, as it were. So 3% is kind of the new 2%. I'm Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Executive Vice President here at the Council. We've got 23 of 32 who've hit 2%. If the NATO plans that Cavoli and others have brought about really call for upwards of 3, how do you bridge that gap? We get that the requirements are there, but how do you field them when you have that kind of delta in a Europe that, as others have pointed out, is not providing the contributions requisite to meet those capabilities? How do you think through those priorities?
Thank you. General Walters, would you like to answer that question?
Jenny, I'll just start with the fact that you can field and use that money as long as you have strategy plans and actual military requirements, which General Cavoli has on the books. They exist. They're all expensive. And the readiness of each one of the soldiers that coincides with all of those hardware, software, and activities that it takes to produce that is something that we can expend. And that 3% will be able to be put against those requirements comfortably.
Okay. Thank you. General Scaparotti?
Yeah, I would just add that because of that, they're actually fielding forces to a location of a specific size. They've got to pay for that to deliver. That's going to make it obvious to them that there is a bill here that's greater than 2%. And then secondly, you know, their leadership in Europe, our leadership in the United States as well, has to make they have to make the argument to the people that we can afford our security and we need to do it now. And that is something, at least in the time I was the SACEUR, I don't think I saw in the same way that it needs to be done today.
And we have time for, actually have time for one more question, unless you wanted to comment on that. Okay, terrific. How should European allies be thinking about their role in European security and NATO leadership?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Back in the days that of the Balkans that Wes was talking about, we actually transferred a NATO mission to the EU. And it worked really well. Periodically, episodically, every now and then in Europe, you hear of them talking about, no, we can't count on the Americans to be here for everything, so we have to have our own capability. My view is they'll never be able to afford both NATO and the separate European capability. But there are ways in which both of those entities can peacefully coexist, and we proved that in the Balkans at least once. So I think the one thing that our country needs to do right now is to reaffirm our intent and our commitment, especially in light of the Russian-Ukraine fight, because as General Clark said, it has global ramifications, and if it doesn't come out right, we're all going to be living in a different world. Number two is, I think, once we do that, and I think it's incumbent on the new administration to reinforce that immediately, then you can tackle the issue of how do you divide up missions when it's European interest only, or American interest only, or both of us together. You can do that. It's just a question of finding the political will to do that. We demonstrated it, as I said, once before. So I think reaffirming commitment, and that's a little shaky right now because of different campaign pronouncements, but reaffirming that commitment, absolutely making no doubt about the fact that we're together, and then secondly, encouraging the Europeans to think about how they might use the same forces under a European hat when necessary.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, General Clark. Thank you, General Jones, General Scaparotti, General Walters, General Breedlove. We thank General Cavoli for joining us earlier in this program. We appreciate you all joining us here today. The Atlantic Council is shaping the global future together with our allies and our partners, and nowhere is our mission more important than with conversations like the one that we had today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Ambassador.